Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian angle on what's going on in the world. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to have you back for another week of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be here with you, our viewers, our listeners, and another session to talk about these important ideas.
Yeah, for those of you that are just getting acquainted with FFF, you can access all of the past issues of the Libertarian Angle and a multiplicity of articles and videos on libertarian economic perspectives and foreign policy perspectives at our website at fff.org. Richard, I thought we would continue our series that we've done in the past on the giants of libertarian thought, and this week focus on Milton Friedman, an economist that I know has had a major impact on both of our lives and our intellectual development. I'll go first, and then I'll kind of turn it over to you to give the details of Friedman and his life. When I was first discovering libertarianism in the 1970s, late 1970s, I discovered the works of Milton Friedman. Now, I'd been an economics major and was basically familiar with Friedman and his ideas, but it really wasn't until I discovered libertarianism that I really appreciated the libertarian perspective that Friedman was bringing. And primarily in a couple of books, The Tyranny of the Status Quo and Free to Choose. And the way Friedman wrote, here was this academic scholar, he won the Nobel Prize. And so he could clearly appeal to scholarly academic audiences, academic papers and the like. But one of the real geniuses of Milton Friedman was that he was able to communicate complex ideas to a regular audience. And of course, I was part of that regular audience. So when I read books like Free to Choose and The Tyranny of the Status Quo, they were very easy for me to understand the principles involved. And then he came out with that great series in conjunction with Free to Choose, which was a video series that was being put, I think, on PBS. That was just absolutely fantastic. Once a week, I think you can access all the videos online that just clearly explain the virtues of free markets and free trade. And he'd show examples, like he'd flash off with a video on Hong Kong to show the virtues of economic liberty. And so the man had a major impact on me. He wasn't exactly the type of libertarian that some of us became, like Austrian economists, but clearly he played a major role in the lives of many of us libertarians. So with that, why don't you take it over and give us a little bit about the background of the life and thoughts of Milton Friedman.
Great, I'm happy to do that. Milton Friedman was born in July of 1912, and he passed away in November of 2006 at the age of 94. He was the son of immigrants who had come to the United States several years earlier. They were Eastern European Jews escaping from political oppression, economic persecution, and lack of economic opportunity. Like many who were able to come to the United States in those decades before the First World War, when there were virtually no immigration restrictions or barriers or hindrances, they came here to make a new life for themselves and then to have their son, who was born in New York City, so that he could have that opportunity that they could have never had in the old country. And of course, he went on to become, without a doubt, one of the most important and well-known and famous economists in the United States of the 20th century. He earned his bachelor's degree in economics from Rutgers University. Friedman went on to earn a master's degree in economics at the University of Chicago in the early 1930s, studying with such famous market-oriented economists there, the older Chicago school, if I can put it that way, Frank Knight, Jacob Viner, Henry Simons, all of whom had a great influence on his thinking for the rest of his life. And he then went on to earn a PhD in economics at Columbia University in New York. At first, he He had to find a job, and it was difficult in the private sector. It was the 1930s of the Great Depression. So, in fact, he went to Washington, D.C., if I remember correctly, around 1935, 36, and went to work as an economist in the New Deal Franklin Roosevelt administration. He did a stint also teaching for a while, but came back to government service and was working in the government during the Second World War. In fact, he wrote a joint autobiography with his wife, Rose Friedman, who he had met in graduate school at the University of Chicago in the early 1930s. And in this joint autobiography, Rose Friedman says that there is one thing that her husband did during his entire professional career for which she never fully forgave him. And that was his proposal during the war years, 1942, if I remember correctly, 43, the institution of income tax withholding. Before that, there had been an income tax since 1913, but because of the thresholds in the 20s, very few people actually paid the income tax. But by the 1930s, with the New Deal and then, of course, the war years, tax rates were radically rose. But the government needed a flow of continuous funds to finance the war expenditures, rather than the lump sum payments that most people were doing once a year. So Friedman and a number of other people proposed the withholding tax. That is, that even before you get your paycheck, on each payday, the government just takes its share of what it estimates you owe on that basis. And so that, of course, which was meant to be a wartime emergency, when the war crisis passes, we'll end withholding tax. The government won't need it. Well, guess what? That's what we have all lived with, withholding tax. And Rose Friedman says in the book that that is one of the few things professionally for which she has never forgiven her husband, Milton, withholding tax. But, of course, what he became most famous for was his contributions to the book Economic Theory and Policy, which became his major focus of his career in the decades after the Second World War, after 1945. He ended up teaching professionally for decades at the University of Chicago, where he helped create, along with some other economists who became very well known, and like himself, a Nobel Prize winner, George Stigler, on creating what became known as the post-World War II Chicago School of Economics, that was very critical of Keynesian economics and heavily in favor of the private competitive market, that is a market free of government regulation and intervention in the arena of society. Now, I want to take a few minutes, if I can, Jacob, to sort of explain in a sort of thumbnail sketch his contributions in these two areas, because this is what made his reputation as an economist and was the entree for him to become such a vocal and significant spokesman for the popularization of economic policy views. First, in macroeconomics, John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist, had published his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. And by the 1940s, it basically had swept the economics profession. Keynes had argued that capitalism was an inherently unstable economic system, susceptible to severe and prolonged periods of economic downturns, recessions, or even depressions, such as in the early 1930s, and that there was no inherent way for markets to escape from the depression on its own. Therefore, he was proposing discretionary and wide government policy powers to use fiscal tools, taxing, spending, and monetary tools, manipulating the supply of money, to try to keep the economy out of recession, and if it fell into one, to sort of goose the economy through public spending and deficits in public works and so on. This became the mantra of what became known as post-World War II macroeconomics from decades afterwards. But Friedman was an early critic of this, saying that the very type of discretionary policy that Keynes and his followers were proposing were more likely to introduce degrees of economic instability and susceptibility of exaggerated degrees of depression and inflation, rather than to reduce these waves of fluctuations. He argued, therefore, rather than discretion, it would be important for the government to follow rules. He offered certain types of rules about how the government should manage its fiscal, that is, taxing and spending policies, And then, most importantly, he became famous for his monetary writings. In 1962, he published the book for which, as an economist, he's probably most famous. And that was an economic history of the United States called A Monetary History of the United States from 1865, the year of the end of the American Civil War, to 1960. He co-authored this with a longtime colleague and collaborator of his named Anna Schwartz. And in this book, they basically try to explain what is the basis of the economic fluctuations, good times, bad times, and so on, that the United States had experienced for practically the century following the American Civil War. And using a theoretical argument and the wealth of historical data and that he collected in the book with Anna Schwartz, they gave an interpretation of explaining the logic of and the historical relevancy of what is known as the quantity theory of money. That is, all other things held given, if there is a prolonged and sustained increase in prices, that is price inflation, it can have only one primary and significant cause or factor behind it, and that is a sustained and continuing increase in the supply of money. And therefore, the booms and busts that the United States, or any other country for that matter, had suffered during this period of which their book was doing a study, could be shown to have as its cause, its origin, its basis, government manipulation and mismanagement of the money supply. He certainly used this to do his particular analysis of how Federal Reserve mismanagement caused and prolonged and intensified the Great Depression of the early 1930s. And then in the post-war period, the continuing periods of inflation and moderate recessions, to which he also said was due to the Federal Reserve's, the American Central Bank's mismanagement of the money supply. This was revolutionary because it basically set the stage in the beginning of the theoretical and policy undermining of a good part of Keynesian economics. The other element of this, Jacob, was a presidential address that he delivered before the American Economic Association, the premier economic association in the United States, at the 1967 meeting, which was then published in early 1968, on what he called the natural rate of unemployment. And basically what he was arguing was against what had become popular in the 1950s and early 60s, something known as the Phillips curve, named after a British economist named Phillips. And this was the idea that at the macroeconomic level, that is the economy-wide level, what policymakers had was a trade-off choice. You could have significant price inflation and have relatively low unemployment. Or you could choose to dampen inflation and have relatively low price inflation, but the trade-off would be high unemployment. So the policy tool that macroeconomists and government policymakers had to decide is, well, how much price inflation would you accept to have a reduced amount of unemployment? Now, what Friedman argued in this presidential address, and to be fair, a number of other economists around the same time, including Edmund Phelps, who, like Friedman, went on to also win a Nobel Prize in later years, argued that there was no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. That, in fact, in the short run, it is true. The government can try to stimulate the economy through deficit spending and printing money, push up demand by government spending, make prices rise, and for a period of time before wage contracts are renewed or adjusted, you could have a larger profit margin, rising prices given the costs, and that could stimulate more employment. But Friedman emphasized the importance of price expectations, and that as workers and other suppliers of resources and raw materials, realizing that in an environment of rising prices for finished goods and services, given their money wages and money input prices, that they're losing buying power, they will start demanding and negotiating for higher wages, higher input prices. And as prices and wages start to catch up with the higher rate of general price inflation, the additional profits that had acted as a stimulus for the increased amount of employment will be dissipated. And in fact, in the long run, there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It has a temporary goose, but then the economy adjusts, and the unemployment may very well return to what it was before this attempted trade-off. Therefore, Friedman argued that if you want low price inflation, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, should not be manipulating and managing and increasing the supply of money. On the other hand, if you want to have relatively high unemployment, then you have to look at the labor market and the resource market. It has to be open and competitive with wages and other input prices determined by the market. It is market clearing prices guided by competitive supply and demand forces that assure that resources, including labor, are fully employed. That is, everyone looking for a job can find a job given the skills that they have to market to employers. This set the entire beginning of the challenge to and eventually the demise of traditional post-World War II Keynesian economics. And I would just mention also the other element of the Chicago School Revolution, of which Friedman was also a part, was at the micro level. The Keynesians and other government interventionists had argued that capitalism suffers from market failures. This could include the tendency towards monopoly and anti-competitive behavior, inefficiencies of various sorts that required government regulation, intervention, government spendings of various types in the market. And Friedman and other Chicago economists, of which, as I mentioned, George Stigl was a prominent figure, challenged all this. They said that if there are rigidities in the market, lack of sufficient adaptation to changing market conditions, it is not due to anything in the market itself, but it has to do with the fact there are government regulations, restrictions, such things as minimum wage laws, all of which prevent markets from working. And Friedman followed his colleague, George Stigl, in emphasizing at various times what became known as the capture theory of government regulation. And that is, the government may introduce regulations supposedly to fix a market failure. But at the end of the day, the very industry being regulated by the government, since they're the experts, they know about the industry, end up become influential and even controlling the regulatory agency that's supposed to be regulating them. So as a consequence, the special interest group being regulated ends up having the power to rig the regulations to their own benefit. And so that significantly undermines much of the arguments originally made for government intervention and regulation. Now, all of this came to then be popularized by Friedman in the 60s and 70s. One other book of his, which you didn't mention in your opening remarks, but was complementary to the ones that you talked about. In 1962 or 1960, I forget, he published a famous book called Capitalism and Freedom. And it was published by the University of Chicago Press. And in this book, he makes some profound arguments. One of the most profound is in the opening chapter. And in this opening chapter, he says and emphasizes that there is a close link and relationship between economic liberty and political and personal freedom. Only if the market is free and unhampered from excessive or undue government regulation, or in principle no regulation, can there be securities of having alternatives to the state on the basis of which people's civil liberties and personal freedoms can be protected. In a famous example that he used, as well as his brother-in-law, Aaron Director, who was also a free market economist, is that think of the situation during the McCarthy era, when the people who were accused of being Communist Party members or sympathizers were being brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and if they worked in the movie industry, often blackballed under pressure from Washington. Now, whether these people were communists or not, they lost their jobs because of accusations of their political views. Now, Friedman and his brother-in-law, Aaron Director, argued that if the state managed everything, like in the Soviet Union, if the government blackballs you, you're out of a job and you starve. They might even throw you in jail, a prison. But the worst that could happen for those writers who lost their jobs from some of their Hollywood positions was that they had to find alternative employment in the private sector. It may not have been what their best qualifications were for or what they preferred, but the existence of a private sector outside of the control, regulation, and command of the government meant that people, challenged, criticized, or even persecuted by the government, could continue to make a living and have degrees of personal freedom by escaping into the avenues and pathways of the private sector outside of government control. In other words, being blackballed by the government did not mean starvation or want or worry. It may not be your first choice, but the private sector gives you the option to be secure in your ability to earn an income and to continue to have wide degrees of personal liberty. This is profoundly important because the argument that Friedman made is that the more the government tentacles of control extend into and then envelop the private sector, the more personal options of freedom and opportunity are reduced because there's fewer and fewer avenues to escape from those tentacles of government control. He then goes on to discuss what he views as market options for Social Security, for education. Many of these are far more controversial with some more consistent or radically libertarians. For example, he advocated the negative income tax. The idea if you're below a certain amount of income, the government would give you a sum of money, and if you start earning more than that, then you're a net payer of taxes. It sort of is a form of what's talked about now about everybody having a guaranteed minimum income. I should mention, because we don't have the time to go into it, is that another great free market economist, Henry Hazlitt, who we spoke about a little bit last time, has a book called Man versus the Welfare State, which came out in the mid-1960s. And in that book, Hazlitt has an excellent chapter on the negative income tax in which, as much as he admires, respected, and was a friend of Milton Friedman's, he challenges the validity or desirability of such a negative income tax. The other thing is that Friedman in this book advocated school choice. Now, in the general sense, of course, what is government doing in the education business? What is the government dictating attendance? What is the government dictating or controlling a curriculum or the selection of teachers? This should all be the private matters of families and individuals having the opportunities of competitive schooling alternatives offered by the market itself. But Friedman talked about vouchers. That is, people should get a credit back from the taxes they pay in the form of a voucher that they could send their own child to the school that they want. Now, of course, if the government is the only monopoly in town for education, and now you're saying parents should have an opportunity to use a voucher to send their kid to a school that they think would be better for them, rather than one that compulsory attendance mandates they specifically attend in a particular location, well, of course, at one level, that's better to have some option than no option if the state is controlling. But the problem with this is that, too, it really is not real school choice. That is the private decision making. And the problem that a number of critics have made over the years, as well-intentioned as Friedman's proposal may have been originally in the environment of 1960, is that once the voucher is used, it has come from implicitly tax revenues. And with tax revenue expenditures comes government strings, influencing what the curriculum would be, the management of the school, the selection of and requirements of licensing by teachers. So in fact, what may seem like a way of introducing market alternatives to a government educational monopoly ends up, in fact, potentially drawing whatever private schools still exist out there into the web of government regulation through the tentacles of control of government voucher regulations. So it was well-intentioned and was probably quite revolutionary in 1960, given the presumption of virtually no support for private school or homeschooling. But from the more recent perspective of market reflections on this, it does not really offer the true market alternative. Now, let me mention a couple of areas where Friedman became better as he aged, like a good wine, if you will. While Friedman criticized Keynesian policies, he did not challenge in his formative writings as a scholar the idea of a central bank or government oversight and management of the money supply, as much as he considered monetary mismanagement to be cause of inflations and depressions. Friedman argued that rather than the discretionary policy that the Keynesians were advocating, the central bank, the Federal Reserve in the United States, should manage the money supply as sort of like on automatic pilot. The economy grows on average and in general, looking over the decades, by about 2.5%, 3% a year. So therefore, the Federal Reserve should just put the money supply on an automatic pilot of increasing the money supply by 2.5%, 3% a year. And that way, a greater amount of money would just match the increase in output, so there'd be neither price inflation nor price deflation. Well, setting aside certain presumptions in that argument, it still assumes that government will manage the money supply. Now, and would not separate it by having a market-based gold standard, for instance. But in his later years, Friedman gave that up. Now, Friedman won the Nobel Prize in 1976, but in the early 1980s, mid-1980s, he began publishing a series of articles. And let me briefly mention them because it showed how he was becoming more market-oriented in the matters of money. In 1985, he delivered a presidential address to the Western Economic Association, which was published in their journal. And he says in this is that public choice theory, that is the application of economics to understanding the political process, spearheaded by such other Nobel Prize economists as James Buchanan, had demonstrated to him that given the self-interested behavior of politicians and bureaucrats, it would never, never be in the interest of bureaucrats to manage the money supply in the interest of the long-run benefit of the society. They will always have pressures from the bureaucracy, the politicians, and special interest groups to manipulate the money supply for short-run gains for political purposes. That was then matched in a couple of articles that came out shortly after that, again in scholarly journals. The Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking, one of Journal of Monetary Economics, in which he basically said that given the history of the Federal Reserve since its establishment in 1913, it would have been far better not to have a central bank and for it to retain the gold standard, because whatever shortcomings and imperfections may be in a market-based money supply such as gold, and no institution is, of course, perfect in some idealistic sense, it would have involved less economic disruption, less cost to the society, and far less occurrences of inflations and depressions than under the controlling centralized mismanagement of the Federal Reserve in the United States. Now, he does not call for the abolition of the Federal Reserve, nor does he then advocate a return to a gold standard. But he is saying that if it had been possible to go back and never institute a Federal Reserve and never go off the gold standard, as occurred during the Roosevelt administration of the early 30s, America would have had a more healthy, stable, and less inflationary environment. That is a major change in the perspective upon which he first got his policy reputation. Now, just to continue with this, because you mentioned free to choose. Now, in the 1970s,
we're almost out of time, so wrap it up.
Okay, so I would just mention the importance of Friedman on these things at a popular level is that beginning in the 1960s and into 1970s, he wrote a regular column in Newsweek magazine. Every third week, he would present these views to the wide popular audience that a magazine like Newsweek then had. And then he came out with this video, Free to Choose, in which he explains the principles of the free economy and the free society, both in America and globally, which was transformative in influencing people, and then in the book version that you talked about. So I would just wrap up, Jacob, by saying that from certain more libertarian or radically or libertarian perspectives, one can say that Friedman, wasn't consistent here, or this policy proposal wasn't particularly classical liberal in some pure sense here. But in the sweep of events of the 20th century, there was no voice, no figure more articulate, more persuasive, more important in the American setting in rediscovering and re-legitimizing free market ideas in the economics profession than Milton Friedman. And in this setting, I would just mention one thing to our viewers. Many of Friedman's television interviews from the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, when he was at the height of his powers, can be watched on YouTube. Here he is at his most masterful, responding to questions, explaining the powers of the free market. Everyone can learn and better their own understanding by watching Friedman at his best.
Yeah, that's an excellent capsulization of Friedman's life from the perspective of a libertarian. I mean, there's clearly overlap between Friedman and the Austrian school to which you and I are both devoted, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, in terms of explaining the virtues of an unhampered market economy and the the horrible disasters that economic interventionism brings about, including through the minimum wage. And for someone that had come into this movement from the Democratic side, the liberal side, who believed that government should be helping the poor and the needy, I mean, this was a big revelation for me, that to learn that minimum wage laws hurt the very people they purport to help, the poor and the disadvantaged, was a big revelation for me, and it was one of the things that attracted me to libertarianism. But there were drawbacks. I mean, another overlap, as you point out, is that Friedman's pointing out one of the real fallacies that I grew up with, and that is that the Great Depression was caused by the failure of free enterprise. I mean, that's drilled into us since we're kids. And all of a sudden, here's Friedman, along with the Austrians, saying, oh, not so. This is government intervention in the monetary sphere, specifically the Federal Reserve System that had come into existence in 1913. And then you mentioned Capitalism and Freedom. There's that great chapter also on occupational licensure, where he takes on medical licensure as the thing that needs to be knocked out. I mean, he said, look, I could pick, like shoe shine artists or hairdressers, but he says, I'm going to take the toughest case and show you why there should be no economic interventionism in terms of medical licensure. And then I'd like to just kind of wrap it up by telling you a little bit about the man personally, from a personal perspective, that I ran into him twice. One on an elevator at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting, and I introduced myself, and it was so exciting because I had just started FFF, and he says to his wife, who was in the elevator, he says, Rose, this is the man that's publishing the little booklet. And of course, that was our monthly publication, Freedom Daily. And then later at another Mont Pelerin Society meeting, I was ordering a drink at the bar, and he just happened to be standing there. And I again introduced myself, and he was the nicest guy in the world. I mean, we engaged in, a 20-minute conversation, and he treated me like I was the most important person in the world. Here's a Nobel laureate. And then finally, he gave a speech after you and I started FFF in 1990. You mentioned vouchers. I wrote an article in our journal, Future of Freedom, that at that time was called Freedom Daily, criticizing vouchers as just another means to try to improve the socialist system, pointing out that vouchers are taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group of people. That caught his attention. He was clearly reading our publication. He gave a speech, and where he criticized me for criticizing him on vouchers and said, well, yeah, but Hornberger doesn't say how to get from here to there. Well, clearly I did. I mean, how to get from here to there in terms of educational liberty is just get the state out of it, repeal compulsory attendance law, repeal school taxes. But he suggests, well, the way to get from here to there is through vouchers. And of course, our response as libertarians is that's only going to make the state more deeply involved in education, because you're putting all these private schools dependent on vouchers and the monies and the budgets that come with them. And that's been proven. I mean, even voucher proponents today do not argue that vouchers are going to end the public schooling system, which at least Friedman did. So there were pluses and minuses, but overall, Richard, I agree with you. This was a monumental giant in terms of explaining the virtues of the unhampered market economy.
Yes, absolutely. One of the great figures of the 20th century from a classical liberal free market point of view.
Yep. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, greatly enjoyed the conversation again, and I'll see you next week.
Absolutely. Until next time.
Yep. And thank you all for tuning in. Again, our website, fff.org.